Chancellor. She's finishing her PhD in the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. That's the School of Interactive Computing. Stevie works broadly in the area of human-computer interaction. She's going to talk today about work that she's doing in deviancy.
Yes.
So look forward to your talk.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Let me test real quick. Great. So thank you guys so much for coming to my talk, and thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to talk to you about how we can use human-centered data science approaches to learn more about mental health and to be able to understand people's behaviors in online communities. Before I get started, though, I've got to warn you that there's some graphic content in this talk. I do research in topics like pro-eating disorder communities, suicide, and self-harm. In this talk, there's a lot of discussion of these topics, as well as some photos from my data sets to give you an idea of the kind of data that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's not meant to shock you, just to show you what these communities look like. And so to warn you, before the slide where a picture that might be graphic appears, I've put this caution sign up in the top right-hand corner so that you know that a disturbing image might be coming. So with that caveat in mind, let's talk about social media and how social media has really revolutionized the way that we think about communicating with our loved ones, right? Social media has augmented and even in some cases extended these kinds of interactions that we have with other people. And in many cases can provide us a sense of community when we may not be physically in proximity to those that we love the most. In the case of me celebrating an engagement announcement with a friend that I haven't seen since college, or perhaps back-channeling through conference talks with friends that are sitting right next to us with funny gifs or other kinds of comments. Social media gives us new avenues to be able to understand how people connect with each other. But not all of social media is so rosy and glamorous, and a lot of social media interactions can actively be harmful. Take the example of Twitter, which has perennially dealt with issues of harassment on its platforms, where people who share dissenting political views oftentimes are harassed, doxxed. Death and rape threats are issued to people, even so much as showing up at people's places of work to try and get them fired for sharing things about their personal lives that might offend somebody else. And a lot of people think, well, why doesn't Twitter just take all of this stuff down, right? We've got a lot of great strategies that we've used before to get rid of what I'm calling like abusive and sort of dangerous kinds of content online. And a lot of times people point to the example of and the success of removing spam from email, right? Spam is in many ways emblematic of what's really annoying and bad behaviors in online space, right? There's a lot of spam. It's mostly text-based. And we've actually been able to fundamentally solve the problem of spam. Even if you get a couple spam emails here and there in your email, spam is considered a solved problem, primarily by representing it as a text-based way to look up keywords that might be related to things that are trying to manipulate you out of, say, your bank information or your tax documents. Things like looking for pharmaceutical words or the metadata of where the email originates from. And in many ways, spam is emblematic of bad behavior to a lot of people online. And this is one of the ways that they actually engage with these kinds of behaviors on an everyday basis. But in 2005, we were able to actually solve this problem with a combined effort from Gmail and Google's massive databases of spam, as well as research in the field. And we've basically gotten rid of spam for the most part in email. But it's not so easy when we deal with things like online content and abusive behavior. And today I'm going to talk to you about an area that's really important to me, which is about mental health and about how people who are strangers come into online spaces to be able to talk about their symptoms, the management of their disease, and in some cases, bad behavior that emerges from these kinds of content. So this is r/depression, which is a group on the social media site Reddit. Over 400,000 people come to this online community who don't know each other, they're all pseudonymous to each other, to talk about the stigmatizing and lonely experience of depression. People in these online communities look for medication advice, how to get treatment from their doctors, how to tell loved ones that they're suffering from depression, and generally to find other people who are supportive of the experience of going through different kinds of depression. And you can see that the support on these communities is really impressive. You might not be able to see the numbers, but some of these posts have 700, 600 upvotes, or 700 people who are agreeing that this content is really, really important. And people reaching out for support like, I make jokes about wanting to be dead. I secretly wish someone would realize I'm not joking, with a bunch of people commenting, supporting their ideas, and trying to help them feel better. And in these cases, online communities provide a lot of positive for people who come to these kinds of spaces looking for support about something that they might not talk to their friends about in person. But just like Twitter is an example of bad kinds of content, there's also uglier kinds of content related to mental health in online space. And today I'm going to talk to you about what I consider dangerous mental health behaviors, things that make psychiatrists really, really worried for patients when they say that they're engaging with them. I'm going to focus today on the pro-eating disorder communities on the internet. Pro-ED, or pro-eating disorder, is a group of people that legitimize eating disorders as lifestyle choices, not as deadly and dangerous mental disorders. And in the case of pro-eating disorder communities, they share content like this on the screen, which is a woman's emphasizing the gap between her thighs or her thigh gap as her credibility for being a good anorexic. They also share things like crazy diet advice, like 500 or 600 calorie diets, paired with multiple days of fasting, ways to conceal binging and purging behaviors from your family, and generally supporting these ideas that anorexia is an acceptable lifestyle choice, rather than engaging with sort of that supportive community to help people manage their eating disorders. Now, in the case of pro-ED, we might consider understanding this problem through the lens of, say, text, but a lot of this content is visual. And importantly, as I've talked to you about before, it's really difficult to try and identify this content. We've been able to find things with, say, spam behaviors to sort of simplify what it means to be spammy. But in the case of mental health and eating disorders, things aren't so easy. So let me walk you through, before I do that, I'm going to show you a community first that exists on the same platform, which is our pro-eating disorder. This was actually banned last week, of all things. And so it shows that the platforms are actively trying to engage with these issues. And people don't just engage sort of in these singular units. There's millions of posts across multiple social networks of people who are trying to find advice for their GWs or their goal weights, which are 70, 80 pounds, which for people suffering from eating disorders is incredibly dangerous and has really, really high mortality rates. People come to these online communities to try and find this support. But the challenge of being able to identify this kind of content from what I showed you earlier about r/depression is that eating disorders and mental health by itself are really, really complicated issues. Now let me walk you through how these disorders are complicated and are different than things like harassment or spam on platforms. First, people are likely suffering from a mental disorder. This could be depression, this could be eating disorders, but fundamentally, people's symptomatology of the way that they experience their mental disorders are different. Even people who share the same symptoms might not have the same experiences, behaviors, and cognitions of somebody who's struggling with mental health. And so each person in many cases is a unique person to engage with in trying to understand how platforms influence their behaviors. Now, these people come into these online communities and they look for support, whether it's support to get over depression or to maintain disordered eating behaviors. And their interactions with the community can be dramatically different. There's also the issue of how does the community impact their behaviors? And there's controversial evidence in the case of pro-eating disorder that these communities can both help people feel better, but also harm their mental well-being. New research shows that people who engage with eating disorder content have lower body image satisfaction afterwards, promoting the same kinds of negative feelings they already have already. But controversial research also shows that people who come to these communities might disinhibit their emotions, thereby talking through their behaviors and not actively taking self-harm actions against themselves. And so you have sort of these contradictory and in many ways complex interactions of the communities on people themselves. But you also have interactions between communities. These aren't just the two mental health communities that exist in social media. There's the r/depression community, but there might be other kinds of communities that engage more deeply with trying to solve problems with other kinds of mental health disorders. In the case of eating disorders, there are pro-recovery communities, people actively advocating for and seeking recovery from their eating disorder behaviors. And the pro-ED community and the pro-recovery community interact a lot and butt heads oftentimes about who's correct about their perceptions of eating disorders. But there's also issues of platforms imposing onto these communities. As I mentioned to you, Reddit just recently banned r/pro-ED. Other kinds of communities might engage in different ways that they promote or sort of hide this kind of content. Say through the Explore tab on Instagram, where content is actively promoted because it's something that you've liked or been interested or engaged in before. They might also quarantine communities so that outsiders or people under the age of 18 can't actively engage with them. But then you also have issues around society and how society thinks of these behaviors, and whose responsibility is it to intervene when we see somebody on our Pro-ED who says that they're about to harm themselves. Or in the case of suicide, someone who has a date, a method, and a plan for ending their own lives. Is it the platform's responsibility? Is it maybe loved ones or other kinds of caregivers? It's not clear whose responsibility this is to intervene in these situations, or if the person is allowed to be able to speak about these issues freely, because it doesn't actively violate any sort of concerns about First Amendment or speech rights from the sense of a government intervention for censorship. And I think one of the challenges in mental health is that a data-driven approach like we use for spam oversimplifies a lot of these concerns and collapses, say, an email that comes from somebody into a single text-based protocol, as well as the metadata itself, to be able to understand whether or not spam stays in your inbox or gets thrown in the spam folder, right? Mental health is way more complicated than this. And simply using a data-driven approach to say, decide what stays up or decide what gets down, ignores the unique effects that online communities can have on people's behaviors and the latent impacts these communities can have on other kinds of people. And I think what we need is a way to be able to represent this kind of complexity, to be able to better understand how people with mental disorders participate in online space, but also how these communities influence their behaviors. So what I do is I design and build these human-centered algorithms to be able to understand mental health, specifically focusing on deviant mental health behaviors in online communities. I threw up a bunch of keywords on the slide, so let's unpack a little bit about what sort of the three big topics of my research are. The first is I built human-centered algorithms. This is a departure from traditional approaches in data science, and my work sort of sits between human-computer interaction and data science because I take a human-centered approach to solving these kinds of problems. By human-centered, I mean that the human is at the primary center as the subject and the object of my research, rather than decoupling the person from, say, online encyclopedia entries, or divorcing the person from their own Twitter feeds and considering their data as separate from the person. At the point that we have to understand mental disorders and the interactions they have in online space, it's important to be able to pair the person with those kind of outcomes. And that means I take specific ethical precautions when I do my work. I consider privacy and the respect of the person and the impacts that these algorithms can have on the people themselves as a primary goal within my work. But I also use human-centered techniques by bringing in human-in-the-loop techniques to be able to disambiguate algorithms, right? Data science algorithms are oftentimes opaque for people who are non-experts in the field. And so I use human-in-the-loop techniques by partnering primarily with domain experts in the space. And these are some of my collaborators that I've worked on prior and current projects. I bring in domain expertise as well as human insights throughout the entire process of building an algorithmic pipeline to be able to predict people's mental health behaviors in online communities. This involves things like annotating data, engineering better features, changing algorithm types when we don't like its interpretability, and understanding how the outcomes of the algorithm can actually have impacts back on clinical work as well as on work about online communities and well-being in online space. But in addition to partnering with domain experts like clinicians, I also work with other stakeholders in this space, like social networks, who are constantly trying to figure out how to manage this kind of content. The other thing I do is primarily build algorithms. I take a data science approach to a lot of my work, using large-scale techniques to be able to understand millions of posts across lots of different social networks. This includes sites like Reddit, Instagram, Tumblr, etc., where these communities actually live. And the approaches that I take are threefold. First, I use machine learning to be able to make predictions about people's behavior in online communities. I use computational linguistics to understand the text content that they're finding, to be able to identify new kinds of treatments or new kinds of advice that they're providing on these spaces, and statistical modeling. I'm not going to be able to talk about sort of all of these papers today. CHI and CSCW are the venues of human-computer interaction. CHI is, by the way, CHI. I'm not going to have time to talk about all of this work today, and I'm only going to be able to talk to you about 3 of these projects. But it's important to remember that these large-scale data approaches let us be able to understand community-wide insights that complement a lot of qualitative or more human-oriented approaches like interviewing or inpatient clinical trials. So we can use these as supplements to be able to expand our knowledge about mental health and how it manifests in these communities. Finally, I use the word deviant mental health behavior, specifically to talk about mental health behaviors that violate social norms of what's acceptable to do to the body. And this is things like pro-eating disorder behaviors, self-harm, and suicide. And I'm drawing deliberately on deviant here rather than dangerous. And deviance from the sense of a sociological perspective of what deviance means. This is a word that's been around in sociology since the late 1800s that describes behaviors that are socially not acceptable to do. And there's a long history of work that allows for us to use the concept of deviance to unpack these behaviors in complex ways, to be able to represent the kinds of interactions that people have in online communities as more than just a person engaging with a large corpus of data. We can actively understand that multi-layered approach that people are using when they start constructing their identities in online space, how the communities impact their behaviors, and how platforms intersect across all those layers before. And deviance is a really excellent lens to be able to understand these kinds of approaches. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to show you an example of how I use a human-centered algorithm to build a classifier to understand a specific form of mental health in online communities. Then I'm going to show you how this algorithmic approach can be used to understand those latent impacts of how platforms can influence these communities in good and in bad ways. Then I'm going to talk to you about some of my current and future work about the use of human-centered algorithms to understand other kinds of mental health behaviors and how it can help us inform better interventions for being able to understand mental health in general. So let's start talking about one example of what is really difficult within online community space. Oftentimes people will go online and see people who post in our depression. Everybody, therefore, who posts in our depression is depressed. But we know that depression is more complicated than that. Importantly, it changes over time, right? People's depression starts mild, it might be more severe. When they receive treatment, it might change in a couple months because as they respond well to, say, a new medication paradigm. And so this first project that I'm going to talk to you about is measuring how mental health changes over time in online communities, or what is known as mental illness severity. We draw from the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, one of the guidebooks for being able to help psychiatrists and inpatient care workers understand these kinds of concepts, to identify characteristics related to mental illness severity, or MIS for short. And this comes from like a clinically intuitive way that they sort of already understand mental health in practice, right? Somebody might be saying that they're about to take urgent action, which means that their severity of their mental health condition is more severe than somebody who is on a maintenance program and not actively considering dangerous actions against their own bodies. So we take this clinically grounded approach to MIS to identify 3 kinds of severe behaviors in online space that we see in these communities. These are suicidal ideation behaviors, self-harm, and weight control behaviors. These are the giant red flags for any kind of psychiatrist who's working inpatient with somebody. If they say that they're self-harming or thinking about harming themselves in a more extreme way, this is what throws their red flags, which might actually encourage immediate interventions in the space. And so what we take is these as the severe notions of what could be mental illness severity in online space. And eating disorder spaces are a really great space to be able to study things like suicidal ideation and self-harm behaviors in addition to weight control measures. Something like 80% of people who have an eating disorder have another comorbid mental disorder that's not an eating disorder, things like depression, OCD, and anxiety. And people with eating disorders exhibit large constellations of symptoms that have nothing necessarily to do with weight control behaviors, even if they don't have another mental disorder like I mentioned before. And so in this case, it's a really good community to understand the vast constellation of symptoms that might concern a psychiatrist who's working inpatient. So what we do is we go and look for pro-eating disorder communities in Instagram. We gather 100,000 users who've publicly used a pro-eating disorder hashtag. The way that we get a pro-eating disorder hashtag on Instagram is by snowball sampling with a human curation approach. I'll walk you through that in a little bit more in depth. But then we gather all of their public post timelines, and it's important to note that all of this data is publicly available. If I told you the hashtags or the usernames of these people right now, you could go and look up their entire profiles. Again, something that I really care about is ethics, and I'll explain more about the issues with being able to just go and look up this kind of content on that again in a little bit. So we gather all their public post timelines, and we get about 26 million posts from 100,000 users. It's about 260 posts per person. And that number is actually pretty consistent. We see very few people who post 1 or 2. So we think that this is actually a really good way to represent people's changes in their mental health over time by looking at their profiles that they've talked about pro-eating disorder content on before. And the reason that we use tags on Instagram to gather this data rather than other kinds of signals is that there's no other sort of community orientations to how Instagram forms and lets people connect with each other. It's done through tags. And tags especially are used on Instagram in ways that signify both the mental health concerns that somebody has, like depression or eating disorders, but also their moods and their emotions and the things that they're thinking about. As you'll see just in a few slides, people are talking about things like #die, #I don't want to live anymore. And we can use these tags as really good indicators of how somebody is feeling in the communities that they want to reach out through these kinds of emotions. So we could just sort of take this approach that I mentioned to you earlier about MIS and those 3 bucket categories of really severe mental health. And we could annotate all of the data, looking for those kind of categories throughout the images, and then come up with a severe mental illness flag and do stuff like that. But that's not subtle, and it's not nuanced to the way that mental illness actually changes in people, right? That runs into the same problem of classifying somebody as always depressed or always not. So we partner with clinical domain experts, 2 people who actually do research in pro-eating disorder communities, but are also clinical partners who actively work inpatient with people who suffer from eating disorders, helping people along the route to recovery. And so we use their insights throughout this whole process to be able to annotate the data, adjust our algorithmic outputs, and leverage their insights to be able to understand the complexities of the ways that people's mental illness severity changes as they talk about it on Instagram. And I think this is a really important step for data scientists to start being able to consider, because a lot of times data scientists don't pull domain experts onto these kinds of projects. And oftentimes these insights are lost to people when these oversimplifications are made of the data. And this is why I think this approach is really, really nice to understand mental health in this space. So we take domain experts and we design a topic modeling approach, using their guidance about how to model these topics in sensible ways that map to their understandings of mental health. We use the topic modeling approach of latent Dirichlet allocation to model all of the topics across all of the tags on these posts. Now there's lots of different kinds of topic models that we could use here, but LDA is really, really appropriate in this space because it lets us model a diversity of topics across a single person. We don't say put one tag on a post as it's about depression or it's about eating disorders. A post can be about depression or eating disorders or perhaps other kinds of things that the person's talking about. But it also lets us model the probabilities of these kinds of topics appearing on a given post, which is a really special characteristic of LDA that lets us understand sort of over time how the probabilities of the presence of these kinds of things changes in our data set. Empirically, we find that 100 topics produces the most semantic results, as evaluated by our domain experts as well as us, being able to interpret the outcomes of the topic model. And we grab the top 50 keywords that are associated with each topic and pass them for a rating task, where we use it to identify mental illness severity in these communities. We then design an annotation task in alignment with guidance from our clinical domain experts. We start by marking those 3 very severe categories that I showed you earlier as high MIS, or level 3, or actions or ideas that actively indicate risk or harm to one's own body. This includes weight control behaviors, self-harm, and suicide. And you can see the tags that emerge within these kinds of topics. #binging and purging, #kill me, #suicidal. Then we de-escalate one step. And so rather than saying that there's either severe mental illness severity, or high levels of mental illness severity, or low mental illness severity, we engineer a second topic, which would be a medium MIS, or what our clinicians call cognitive markers of severity. These are things that they might note while working inpatient with somebody, but might not necessarily take action on. It might be a follow-up item about the cognitive things that people are thinking of or trying to negotiate through their therapy sessions. Things like fat talk, self-deprecation, social isolation, general chatting about suffering from a mental disorder. And then we de-escalate one level and say low MIS, which are unrelated topics about mental health. And the reason that we keep low MIS rather than no MIS is because these people have self-disclosed to participate in pro-eating disorder communities. So even if their mental health is getting better over time and they're actively seeking treatment and are able to manage their disorders, they've still actively chosen to continue to participate in these communities. And we want to model a baseline that's appropriate for this kind of engagement that they self-selected into participating in. So we mark this as low rather than no or 0. So we have the domain experts annotate this whole data set. 5 topics we annotated as high MIS or level 3, 6 are medium, and 89 or the rest are low, which is something that's really interesting, that almost 90% of the topics in this data set are low MIS. And here you can see some examples of these kinds of topics. On the left, it starts at low and moves over to high. On the low MIS scale, we can see that this is a topic actually about travel and people discussing where they've been recently. In this case, it mostly focuses on New York. You see Brooklyn, NYC, New York, there's some LA. This topic appears actually really frequently in our data set because people love to talk about their travel experiences. Then we see that we start to get some of the disorder chat in levels 2 and in levels 3. Now, you might be wondering why anorexia and anorexic appears in MIS level 2 and MIS level 3. Ideally, somebody who's talking about anorexia is just general disorder chat. But one of the nice things about LDA is it lets us model words into different kinds of topics to represent the kinds of conversations that happen around the conceptualization of anorexia. In the case of medium or MIS level 2, anorexia is being put alongside tags about recovery. Hashtag beat Anna, hashtag eating disorder recovery, hashtag Anna recovery. People are talking about anorexia in terms of their recovery journey, which is a different characterization than the way that they're thinking about it in the high category, which is alongside things like hashtag Mia, which is short for bulimia, hashtag sad, self-harm, cutting, suicidal, hashtag anorexia, hashtag anorexic. In this case, anorexia is being thought of as the active disorder that they're participating in, and the kinds of actions that they're considering positioning their behaviors in that are way more severe than the discussions that are surrounding the recovery kinds of content that we see with the use of anorexia. And so by using a topic model like LDA, we're able to actually map these differences, and the model can understand the differences between these kinds of uses of the same word. So then we take the weighted average MIS for a post. We take their tags, the probability that it appears in any given topic, given the words around it, and we sum up all of those ratings that the domain experts had based on the presence of the topic in the data set. We then round it so that we get for every single post 1, 2, or 3, or a low, medium, or high annotation for the level of mental illness severity. And we do this across all 26 million posts in our data set. We then grab a sample of these posts and ask our domain experts to rate how our algorithm is actually able to annotate these kinds of mental illness severity cues that we wanted to be able to come up with an automated way to do so. And in this case, it actually does a really good job. Something like the agreement between the domain experts, or the clinicians in this case, and the algorithm, something like a Cohen's kappa rating of 0.85, which functionally is an almost perfect alignment with the ratings that the algorithm comes up with and the ones that they blind put onto these posts that we ask them to look at. So we could use this data to be able to understand 26 million posts in online communities, right? And we could then have an understanding of how MIS looks across all of the pro-eating disorder community on Instagram. But one of the powerful things about these annotations is because they're so well clinically grounded and aligned with our experts, we can use them to predict a mental illness severity in the future. So what we do is we engineer a prediction task where we infer MIS in the future with a monthly granularity. Monthly granularity accounts for the kind of posting inconsistencies that people can sometimes have on the platform. We use this feature as the monthly aggregates of MIS over 7 months, and the outcome variable is MIS in the 8th month. We then use the method of regularized multinomial logistic regression to be able to come up with 3 different categories of outputs for the categorical analysis that logistic regression lets us do. A category of 7 months rather than another one is through empirical testing of our model. And what we're able to find is with a W, or a window size of 7, that we get the best performance in terms of accuracy and F1, a harmonic between precision and recall. Now, our model is actually very accurate in making the correct decision about what mental illness severity should be mapped onto a given post using human annotations as our ground truth. But impressively, the F1 harmonic is actually really high as well. For reference, F1 sort of harmonizes between precision, or the number of false positives in data sets, and recall, which is the number of false negatives. Higher is better. And so in this case, we actually balance between low false positives and low false negatives. And when bringing this kind of a system into practice, we don't want to sacrifice either of those because of the risks that could happen of misannotating somebody's mental illness severity on online communities and in clinical practice. So what we do is we then run this across the data set and make predictions about how mental illness severity looks in the future. And we're able to graph this as a line chart over time with 0 months starting in about 2011, which is when the first data points in our analysis pop up. Now, the two axes are a little different, so let me quickly run through how this graph looks. On the left-hand side is the fraction of users who are medium or high. This starts at 0 and goes all the way to 0.15, so 15%. Medium and high are represented as blue and red in the line chart. On the right-hand side is the fraction of users who are low, which is represented by the green line. That axis starts at 0.7 and goes to 1, or 70%. And so what you might actually see in this is because of the differences of the axes, there's a ton of content that is rated as MIS 1 or low MIS, which might be surprising, right? People are oftentimes use secret accounts to talk about their mental health because they don't want their family or their friends to know that they're suffering from mental illness. But what we actually find is most people talk about things like cats, iPhones, and travel. Rather than having their entire lives be dominated by their mental illness, they show a diversity of things that they care about, which is actually how mental illness works. It's only one component of our identity. But we also see this concerning trend of mental illness severity increasing over time, something like 13% year over year. And only 12% of posts, give or take, are MIS level 2 and 3, but this is going up. We weren't actually able to causally determine what's going on in this data set. Because this is an observational study, we can't actually experimentally understand why people might be posting more severe content in online space. Now, we could follow this up with some experimental approaches, but our intuition is that people are starting to come to Instagram as the place to sort of gather about pro-eating disorder communities. And a way to understand this content, or this spike, is that as more people come into the platform, the number goes up. We don't know if this is because the platform is encouraging people to be worse, or if more severe people are coming into the platform, and that distinction would need to be done in follow-up studies, which are difficult to do because you need experimental ways to understand people's behaviors. But what we're able to build to understand these kinds of behaviors is a scalable approach that incorporates topic modeling and predictive strategies to be able to understand mental illness severity, a more complicated mental illness characteristic that people present in clinical space. And I think that this has a lot of really cool applications, right? Instagram, for instance, could adopt this method to understand community well-being across not only just pro-eating disorder, but also tune to other kinds of communities that they might care about monitoring their well-being. Perhaps other kinds of mental disorders, or groups of people who are routinely dealing with higher rates of mental disorders than other groups, like LGBT populations. But I also think that this could be really useful in clinical practice, and being able to incorporate this into tools for a clinician to be able to see, with the consent of the patient, obviously, but to being able to see these changes over time of somebody's mental illness severity, perhaps as a way to evaluate when something might happen in the future, but also as a sort of a shorthand way to understand other kinds of behaviors that the person is presenting that they don't talk about in their in-person hour-long clinical appointments that they have every week with their doctor. So now I've shown you how we can use a human-centered approach to be able to understand mental health in online communities. Now I want to move out to that second or third layer in that diagram that I talked to you about earlier, about how mental health and online communities interact, and talk to you about how we can use human-centered algorithms to be able to understand the impacts that these communities have on these kinds of behaviors. And in this case, I'm going to talk to you about what happens when communities try and regulate this kind of content, specifically focusing on the case study of Instagram and moderation. In 2012, Instagram banned all pro-eating disorder hashtags, starting with the really, really basic hashtag of thigh gap. There were 17 others that were banned like it. Hashtag thigh gap, hashtag pro-anorexia, hashtag pro-ana. What we found is that they banned this because they wanted to try and promote less self-harm in the communities. And the way that we know that is that's what they said when they did the banning. But what we also found is that the community started adopting these sort of odd variations of hashtags to try and dodge this ban. This ban was only done in sort of a really straightforward string matching approach, where hashtag thigh gap, spelled out like it is there, was removed off the platform, and no content would appear when you looked up the hashtag. But people started adopting, and the news also caught on to this, slight variants of the ways that hashtag thigh gap was appearing on the platform. So what you see is this is the original hashtag thigh gap, crossed out because it got banned. After that popped up hashtag thigh gap with 2 Ps. Hashtag thigh gap with a Y instead of an I. Things that are basically visually identical to hashtag thigh gap with an I at the beginning. Instagram gets wind of this and bans hashtag thigh gap with 2 Ps, then hashtag thigh gap with 3 Ps, 3 Ps and a Y, awkward drops of other kinds of syllables. Fundamentally though, the hashtag is the exact same word in that we are able to recognize its relationship back to thigh gap. but people were adopting this because they wanted to dodge the original ban of the string match keyword. And so we were wondering, like, oh, this is an amazing opportunity to be able to understand the impact that the community's banning strategies has on these behaviors that we see in online space. Because we can track, as people get banned, what kinds of hashtags pop up and the ways that these communities change over time. Yeah? Uh-huh. Yes, it's by Instagram platform level, down all of Instagram.
But you were referring to communities banning or regulating.
Sorry, I mean that Instagram is doing the regulation, not the community itself. That was an imprecise word use, yeah. So Instagram made these bans initially, and the crossed out words are the ones that Instagram banned after the original ban in, I think it's April of 2012. So what we can see is we can track this as sort of two categories of words. The root hashtag, which is the one that was initially banned in April, and all of the ones that pop up afterwards. And we can segment the communities and understanding who uses the bans originally and what happens to the communities afterwards. And so we can use this approach of coming up with roots and variants to be able to answer two questions, or ask two questions of this data set. First, how do pro-eating disorder communities adopt these lexical variants? And is there, even though I've shown you this nice little tree diagram, a predictable way that we can identify these kinds of variants? And what happens to the community afterwards? So what we do is we come up with another large data set of about 8 million posts related to eating disorders. We do so by identifying known eating disorder keywords within the Instagram data set, things like hashtag eating disorder, hashtag anorexia. These keywords aren't actually banned. Talking about eating disorders in Instagram is actually quite okay. They don't mind if you talk about it. It's when you start to get towards this self-harm component of pro-eating disorder communities that they start to get concerned. Then we identify 2.5 million tags that have a root or a variant tag. And so we find, again, 17 roots that were banned in April 2012 and 750 lexical variants. Let me show you how we get those 750 lexical variants that pop up. So, as I mentioned earlier, people are dodging the initial string matching approach that people are taking. So what we do is we develop a set of rules to ID lots and lots and lots of pro-eating disorder hashtags. We then find all hashtags that match that intuitive way that people are sort of manipulating the hashtag to get around the ban, but keep that semantic meaning of the hashtag the same. And then we manually filter out semantically unrelated results. So the manual filtering is really important because we actually get over 3,000 hashtags in this space that might match a regular expression keyword approach to be able to find the things that could be variants. So let me show you what are some examples of could be variants and what are actually not legitimate variants. In this case, hashtag Anna with lots of A's at the end is probably an obvious variant given what I just showed you about hashtag thigh gap. Bunch of A's stuck on the end, the semantic meaning of the tag is the same. But then the algorithm also picks up things like hashtag Anna tips and hashtag Anna what. And the way that we're actually able to identify this is with a regular expression matching approach. For those of you that aren't experts in regular expressions, I'm not either, this is ends repeated a bunch of times, A repeated a bunch of times, with anything at the end. And we stick the anything at the end to be able to catch all of the kinds of variants that semantically match the original one, to be able to find new or unexpected variants that they're coming up with organically as they navigate these banning strategies. But that string matching approach that I just described to you with the regular expression catches these other two hashtags. You might be wondering, okay, well, are these actually related to pro-eating disorder communities? And what we find is that they're not. The only way we're able to find that, though, is with the manual annotation and being able to look through the community and say hashtag Anna tips is tips for people who have anorexia, not to maintain the disorder, but how to deal with it on a day-to-day basis, right? Maybe covering your mirror with positive self-affirmation quotes, talking to a friend when you feel really, really upset and you might consider harming yourself. Just tips for dealing with anorexia, not actually related to pro-eating disorder behaviors. A subtle but important difference when you're looking at the ban and the influence of the hashtag. Hashtag Anna what, on the other hand, is actually a recovery hashtag, meaning hashtag anorexia, like what? The thing that I don't even have anymore, right? The disorder that I'm trying to overcome. And so the manual annotation approach here is really important to be able to get out these two data points and the communities and the posts that are associated with them because they're noise, to being able to understand the kinds of impacts that these communities and these banning strategies have on the behaviors of people. So we're able to actually conceptualize this as a pretty regular step are a pretty regular change method using Levenstein's edit distance, which basically counts the number of changes made by inserting letters, removing letters, or changing things within a word. And so what you can see here is that before this is about April 2012, you see a couple hashtag variants popping up, which you might actually see because people misspell hashtags, right? Occasionally they pop up in our data set. But what you can see here is that after April 2012, there was a much larger increase comparatively in the number of variant hashtags that follow those conventions that pop up in the data set. And so we're able to algorithmically find these hashtags that people come up with on Instagram after they ban them in April. And so now that we're able to find these sort of root hashtags and the variants that pop up, we can then go back to those 2 research questions that I talked to you about earlier. Now that we can identify the community, we can ask what happens to the behaviors in these platforms as Instagram has actively tried to get rid of them. In the interest of time, I'm only going to talk to you about the topical changes as it relates to mental health. But the short version is that we find that activity on some of those hashtags increases and the communities around them, and that users and supportive behaviors actually go up, and that people are more likely to post and more likely to engage in the kinds of content by number of comments and number of likes on the kinds of posts. So people's engagement with the content actually goes up. But the topical change, I think, is the most interesting, because if you're Instagram, people are liking and commenting more. That might not necessarily be a bad thing. But if the topics change or things get better or worse, that's actually where you care about in removing kind of self-harm content from online communities. So we use spectral clustering to be able to find posts that are related to the roots, or hashtags that are related to the root hashtags, and posts that are related to the variants. And we separate these into 2 discrete buckets, which is nice because, quite frankly, the communities don't actually cross-post to these kinds of hashtags consistently. And what we find is that the posts on the roots, which were before that 2012 ban, were actually like MIS level 2, as I mentioned before. Things like hashtag body check, fat, tiny, anxiety, beautiful. Sort of normal cognitive preoccupations of people who are suffering from eating disorders. But what we find is that from the variants, the content gets way more severe and way more toxic, closer to an MIS level 3. I didn't engineer these words either. These were actually just the top keywords that came out of our clustering approach. And so we see things like hashtag addiction, cutting, useless, self-harm, suicide, and die. Things that are way more concerning about the kinds of content that they're talking about. And quite frankly, is way more severe than what we saw on the original root hashtags. And so what we're able to determine is that Instagram's moderation strategies were quite frankly ineffective at actually reducing this kind of behavior, and actively caused an increase in more toxic and more dangerous content in these kinds of communities. And we were able to go back and validate this when we had the nice separation of those hashtags that I mentioned to you before. We went back and verified, and we saw the exact same thing. And so I think that this is a really important study to being able to understand how platforms can dramatically impact people's mental health expressions as they're participating in online communities. Maybe they're not participating for, say, the most positive reasons, right? But this ban is actively causing a lot more negative content to appear on the platform. Perhaps Instagram could use this insight to be able to understand what a ban might do to these kinds of sensitive communities that may not have anybody else to even talk about what are really stigmatizing and dangerous experiences of people suffering from pro-eating disorder ideas. So I've shown you how human-centered algorithms can understand mental health and also understand the impacts that these communities have on people's well-being when they try to interact with or remove them from the platforms. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about future directions, about current work that I have going on now, about human-centered algorithms and their ability to understand other kinds of mental health behaviors. And what I want to get into soon is designing interventions to be able to compassionately and effectively deal with some of the negative impacts of these platforms. And how I see this kind of framework of a human-centered approach to data science and HCI as a way to understand many kinds of behaviors in online communities. So the first project that I've been working on is actually one related to opioid addiction. And this is a new project that I have that I think I will literally get an email in about 4 hours as to whether or not this paper got in. So I'm very excited about it. But opioid addiction has been a really big health crisis within the US. According to the CDC, I think more people die from opioid overdoses than do from car accidents year over year. Something like over 43,000 people. And this isn't just overdoses from big scary drugs like heroin and fentanyl. These are people who are overdosing on painkillers that they get addicted to after surgeries. and other kinds of opioids. And fundamentally, there's lots of resources that the CDC and other parties are actually trying to deploy to counteract these really, really concerning statistics, the number of deaths and risks that opioid addiction poses. And these resources tend to be in things like halfway houses, maintenance programs, trying to get people into methadone, the sort of gold standard for maintaining a lack of or abstinence from opioids. But not all of the people have resources to these kinds of treatments. In many cases, they're very expensive. And having to go to a methadone maintenance clinic every 48 to 72 hours because they'll only give you 3 sets of pills, they're worried about you overdosing on the methadone, can be really shameful for people. And so in addition to the supplementing other kinds of behaviors in online space, people are going online, obviously, to look up support for their recovery journeys. This is r/opiates recovery, another sub-community on Reddit that supports all kinds of recovery techniques. So we initially went in to go look at the kinds of ways that people were using and talking about and encouraging things like methadone or Suboxone, known categories of drugs that are really effective at stopping people from using opioids. And you can see people here talking about how to avoid methadone fatigue, using methadones and subs for chronic pain and then eventually tapering off. Subreddits about supporting people as they get off of these medications, in addition to opioids, but as well as things like methadone. But what we actually found was that people were coming to this community to come up with what I'm calling folk, or alternative ways to recover from opioid addiction. Strategies and substances that have no grounding in the clinical literature. And we wondered if this was happening across all of Reddit, not in just our opiates addiction. So what we did is we found 63 drug subreddits across all of Reddit. And this is really, really broad swath of illicit and pharmaceutical drugs. It's about 1.5 million posts. Using a transfer learning approach, based on the knowledge that we get from our opiates addiction, we build a classifier that can identify recovery chatter around opioid recovery across all of Reddit. What we find is that that algorithm is actually really accurate, about 83% accurate. And we find about 93,000 posts of people talking about recovering from opioid addiction. We then go through the data set and look up look up words that are related to known alternative substances. So there's a couple known alternative substances already within the clinical community, things like kratom and ibogaine. Kratom you might have heard of because the FDA was freaking out about a salmonella outbreak in the sourcing of kratom in the last year or two. So we look up kratom and words that are related to it. Drawing from the adverse drug reaction literature, we use word embeddings from natural language processing. And what we actually find is lots of drugs that people are coming up with really crazy ways, in ways that they're trying to recover from opioid addiction. The first of which is the abuse and use of Imodium, an antidiarrheal that's constantly prescribed to people who are going through opioid withdrawal. It stops one of the worst symptoms of opioid withdrawal, which is diarrhea. And in this case, we find that people are coming up with slang names to describe Imodium. They call it loperamide or loop for short. And this person actually gets hooked on loop because at high enough doses, Imodium is actually an opioid. And there's one study from 1985 that I found that actually confirms this. But there's hundreds of people on this site that are now abusing Imodium because they wanted to get off of heroin or fentanyl. And this person's now been hooked on Imodium for a year. And now you might be thinking, okay, well, being hooked on Imodium is probably uncomfortable, but probably not as bad as being hooked on heroin. But I agree with you, right? Imodium's a way safer drug than heroin is. But the problem is that people aren't just being hooked on safer versions of the things that they were on before. They're actually getting hooked on things like benzodiazepines as ways that they think that they're going to recover from opioid addiction. So briefly, benzodiazepines are antidepressants and are also downers or depressants on your CNS. Like an opioid is also a downer on your CNS. Combining benzodiazepines and opioids is really, really, really risky because both put you at risk for respiratory failure. You'll basically stop breathing and you'll die. And so when you combine benzos with opioids, you have a lot of risks of overdosing. And in this case, people are trying to use benzos as replacements for opioids. But what ends up happening, as the community reports, is that this person is now hooked on benzos and now has a higher risk of being hooked on opioids later. The other thing that's really risky about benzos is that withdrawing from benzos can actually kill you. Withdrawing from opioids is terrible, but it won't actually put you at risk or put you at a mortality risk. And so people are now getting hooked on benzos, as well as a combination of other drugs that we see on the platform. Something like 8 to 10 drugs arranged in these really elaborate stacks of medication that people are trying to overcome their opioid addictions with. Take the benzo at 8 p.m., wake up and take something for my restless leg syndrome at midnight because I can't sleep through the night. Wake up and drink a beer at 8 a.m. because it takes the edge off, right? These elaborate combinations of drugs to recover from opioid addiction that fundamentally have no clinical grounding. And we're really excited about this research to be able to help clinicians understand how people are trying to recover from opioid addiction, but also to help people who are inpatient understand how to understand and contextualize the use of these medications in new and interesting ways, right? These people aren't using these drugs to get more high. They're self-reporting that they're trying to get off of heroin or they're trying to get off of Percocet and trying to recover from their opioid addiction. And so this project is something I'm really excited to continue to work on, to understand these kinds of behaviors that people are experiencing when they're trying to come up with ways to recover from opioid addiction. But the other thing that I really care about is actually doing this work in alignment with people, right? I really care about people, and I really care about doing this work right. Now, I think a lot of us might have heard about the Facebook emotional contagion study where Facebook manipulated our mood, and then it got published in PNAS, and it's caused quite an uproar, and sort of a watershed movement for ethics in HCI and sort of computer science broadly. But fundamentally, none of my work that I've shown you is approved by the IRB. They actually kick my proposals back at this point because they say, well, this is public data. These people are self-disclosing this information. There's no risk to their behavior. You're not interacting with them. Keep going. And this isn't just a standard that I've seen at Georgia Tech. This is actually really consistent across all the studies in this field. And this actually really bugs me. I might be the only scientist that will tell you that I want more oversight on my research because I think that there's a lot of risks that this work can have on people's well-being. And so I started working on sort of a critical literature review of the study designs in this space to be able to understand the decisions that people make so that we can start to use this information about how people do the kind of work that I do to be able to understand and make conclusions about what we should do in the future and what perhaps oversight on these kinds of studies could look like and who might be the ones to come up with that level of oversight. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is the best way to design interventions in this space. I think a lot of these clinical approaches are really useful to be able to bring into different kind of places, to be able to make compassionate and effective interventions for stopping things like pro-eating disorder, suicidal ideation, and in this case, opioid addiction. But it's not clear whose responsibility it is to intervene in these kind of spaces and what stakeholders need to be involved. And so in the future, I'm really excited to start thinking about effective ways to bring in social media data and other large sources of data to be able to understand mental health and be able to bridge and bring these ideas into clinical care, into social networks to be able to understand these kinds of concepts. And so fundamentally, my work contributes to this understanding of people's mental health in online social spaces. And the online social space is a really rich and honest place that we can go to get these kinds of insights about people's behaviors that we might not see in clinical practices otherwise. And I'm really excited about what the future of this work can do to be able to help with mental health. I'd like to quickly thank my collaborators, my committee members, my undergraduate research assistants, as well as all of the organizations that directly and indirectly have supported my work. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm done, yeah.